He lay motionless on a cold airport bench, ignored by thousands of travelers rushing past. No one knew his name. No one cared. Until the billionaire who owned the airport herself walked in. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Let's continue this story. The boy lay so still on the cold, hard bench of the airport that for a moment, people passing by wondered if he was even breathing. His small frame was curled up, his thin arms wrapped around himself as though he could squeeze out the hunger gnawing at his belly or the fear that had been gripping him for days. His skin was pale from exhaustion, but his face carried the unmistakable features of a child too young to bear the weight of the world, and yet too old in the eyes to be called innocent anymore. Travelers hurried past him, dragging their expensive suitcases, sipping overpriced coffees, clutching tickets that promised reunions and vacations. No one stopped. No one asked why a little black boy, no more than 10 years old, was lying motionless in an airport meant for rushing adults, businessmen, and dreamers heading to distant skies. To everyone else, he was invisible, just another shadow lost in the chaos of a busy terminal. But the truth was, he wasn't invisible at all. A handful of people had noticed him. The security guard had walked by earlier, glanced down, and frowned, but decided not to get involved. He was too close to his lunch break, and children weren't his problem. A flight attendant, wheeling her cabin bag, had slowed down, her heart tugging for a second, but then reminded herself that her flight was boarding soon, and besides, airports had rules. A janitor had swept near the bench, looked at the boy's worn-out sneakers with the laces torn, and thought of his own son at home, but he walked away without saying a word. The world had seen him, but the world had decided to pretend it hadn't. What no one knew was that this child had been sitting here for 2 days. His name was Samuel, though no one had asked. He hadn't eaten anything but half a granola bar someone had dropped, and he had drunk water only when he gathered enough courage to slip into the restroom and sip from the tap, terrified someone would yell at him. His stomach ached, but worse than the hunger was the emptiness in his heart. His mother was gone. His father had never been in the picture. His aunt, the one relative who had promised to take him in, had never shown up. The boy had been brought to the airport by a social worker who told him someone would come get him, but no one ever did. And so he had waited, hour after hour, until the waiting became unbearable and his small body gave up, leaving him lying on that bench as though he were part of the furniture. No one could have guessed that this airport, this vast, glittering structure of glass and steel, belonged to one of the wealthiest women in the country. Her name was Eleanor Briggs, a billionaire who had made her fortune in luxury real estate and hospitality. To most people, she was untouchable, unreachable, a woman whose life was written about in magazines and whose face appeared on business covers. They called her ruthless, brilliant, a queen of steel and glass. Few had ever seen her in person, and certainly, no one expected her to show up unannounced in her own airport, without a swarm of assistants or guards, wearing nothing more than a navy coat and her hair tied back. But Eleanor was there that evening, walking briskly across the terminal floor, her heels clicking with a rhythm that made heads turn. She had come straight from a board meeting in Paris and wanted to see for herself how things were running in her empire. She always believed that the true test of leadership wasn't in numbers on a chart, but in walking through the places you owned and feeling them breathe. And it was in that breath, in that walk, that she saw him. At first, Eleanor's sharp eyes scanned the polished floor, the security lines, the duty-free shops filled with eager customers. Then, like a needle in the midst of silk, she noticed the boy on the bench. He didn't move when she passed. He didn't even blink. Something about his stillness made her pause. Eleanor Briggs did not pause for anyone. She was known for sweeping through rooms like a storm, for making decisions that broke companies and built empires. Yet here she was, frozen in her tracks by the sight of a child who seemed lost to the world. She walked closer, her footsteps slower now, her sharp gaze softening with each step. Up close, she could see the faint rise and fall of his chest. He was breathing, thank God. But she could also see his shoes, battered and falling apart, his hands trembling even in sleep, his lips dry and cracked. Eleanor's throat tightened, a rare and unfamiliar sting that she usually pushed away. She was not a woman who allowed emotion to control her. But something about this boy pierced the armor she had built around herself over decades. For the first time in years, she felt something that business deals and boardroom victories could never give her. An ache, a tug, a question that screamed louder than any numbers on a balance sheet. Who is this child? And why has no one cared enough to help him? The world had walked past him, but Eleanor Briggs could not. And as she stood there, her billion-dollar empire humming around her, she didn't realize that this single moment, this decision to stop, was about to change not just the boy's life, but her own in ways she never imagined. Eleanor's instinct told her to act, but decades of habit made her hesitate. She had built a life on logic, on calculations and risk assessments. Feelings had no place in her empire. Still, she couldn't take her eyes off the boy. Slowly, she lowered herself onto the bench beside him. The leather of her coat brushed against his thin arm, and he flinched violently, jolting awake. His eyes flew open, wide and terrified, darting around as though he expected to be struck or chased away. When his gaze landed on Eleanor, he froze again, his small chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. "It's all right," Eleanor said softly, though softness was not a tone she used often. "You're safe." The boy blinked, confused. Safe was not a word that existed in his world. He sat up, clutching his knees, his shoulders hunched as though ready to run. Eleanor noticed the way he glanced at her handbag, then at the exits, calculating escape. He had the wary look of a child who trusted no one. She understood it. She had worn that look once, long ago, before fortune had reshaped her destiny. "What's your name?" she asked. He said nothing. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Instead, he tucked his chin deeper against his knees. "All right," Eleanor murmured. "No names, then." "That's fine." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small bottle of water. Without a word, she set it on the bench between them. The boy's eyes flicked to it instantly, then back to her, suspicious. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, as though hunger had won the war against mistrust, his tiny hand darted forward, grabbed the bottle, and twisted the cap with desperate fingers. He gulped the water so fast it spilled down his chin. Eleanor had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep her face steady. "Slow down," she whispered. "No one's going to take it from you." The boy didn't stop until the bottle was empty. He dropped it onto the floor, then pressed his hands to his stomach as though the cool liquid might ease the hollow ache. Eleanor glanced around the terminal. Dozens of people were still walking past, not a single one noticing them. Her jaw tightened. How many had ignored him? How many had watched this child struggle and done nothing? "Are you here with someone?" she asked after a pause. "A parent? A guardian?" This time, his lips moved, and a single word slipped out, so faint she almost missed it. "No." Eleanor's chest tightened again. She leaned back slightly, her mind racing. A boy alone in her airport. No food, no adult, no explanation. She could call security, but she already knew what would happen. They'd file a report, shuffle him into the system, and he would vanish into statistics. She had seen it before, countless times. Children like him disappeared into files, their names lost in bureaucratic dust. Something inside her rebelled against that thought. "Have you eaten?" she asked. The boy shook his head quickly. Eleanor rose to her feet. "Come." His eyes widened in alarm, and he pressed himself against the bench as though expecting punishment. Eleanor stopped, realizing her mistake. She crouched so her eyes were level with his. "I'm not going to hurt you. I promise. But you need food, and I can get you some." He stared at her, his gaze darting between her face and the floor. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he slid off the bench. He was so small, his head barely reaching her waist. Eleanor placed a steadying hand near his back, not touching, but close enough to guide, and led him toward one of the cafes in the terminal. The cafe was warm and bright, filled with travelers sipping lattes and typing on laptops. The smell of fresh bread and roasted coffee drifted through the air. As they entered, the boy's steps faltered, overwhelmed by the sight of so much food. Eleanor guided him to a table in the corner. A waitress appeared, her smile polite but distracted. "What can I get you?" she asked. Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Bring him the largest meal you can. Eggs, toast, pancakes, fruit, milk. Whatever you've got." The waitress blinked. "For him." She glanced at the boy, her brow furrowing. "Yes, for him." Eleanor's tone left no room for argument. The waitress scribbled and hurried away. The boy sat stiffly, his small hands gripping the edge of the table, eyes fixed on the counter where plates of food were lined up. Eleanor watched him silently, her mind filled with questions she didn't ask yet. She knew pressing too hard would only scare him off. When the food arrived, his restraint shattered. He ate as though the plate might vanish if he paused for even a breath. Pancakes disappeared in seconds, fruit followed, toast gone, milk drained. Eleanor sat across from him, saying nothing, letting him devour. By the time he leaned back, his belly full for the first time in days, tears welled in his eyes. He tried to hide them, but Eleanor saw. "It's all right," she said softly. "Eat as much as you want. There's more if you need it." The boy sniffled, rubbing his face with the back of his hand. Then, in a voice rough with exhaustion, he whispered, "Samuel." Eleanor tilted her head. "Samuel?" He nodded. "That's my name." Her chest ached at the sound. Finally, the child had given her the first piece of himself. She leaned forward slightly. "It's nice to meet you, Samuel. My name is Eleanor." The name meant nothing to him. He didn't know he was sitting across from the woman who owned the very building they were in, the billionaire whose empire stretched across continents. To him, she was just a stranger who had given him food, water, and a moment of safety. And in that moment, Eleanor Briggs felt something stir inside her that she hadn't felt in decades, the fragile beginning of connection. What she didn't know was that Samuel's story was far darker and far more dangerous than she could possibly imagine. And by stepping into his life, Eleanor was about to uncover secrets that would threaten not only her reputation and fortune, but also the very core of her heart. The cafe grew louder as more travelers arrived, but at the small corner table, time seemed to move differently. Samuel sat quietly now, his hunger momentarily eased, his eyes heavy but watchful. Eleanor studied him carefully, her sharp mind working the way it always did in business, collecting clues, reading body language, searching for the unspoken. Children didn't end up alone in airports for no reason. Somewhere in his silence, there was a story. "Samuel," she said gently, "how long have you been here?" He hesitated, his gaze flicking to the floor. Then, in a small voice, he whispered, 2 days. Eleanor's breath caught. 2 days. Alone. In this building where she prided herself on perfection, where her employees were trained to notice everything. This child had been left unseen. A flicker of anger stirred inside her, not at Samuel, but at the machine of her empire that had failed so utterly. "Where's your family?" she asked carefully. Samuel's face tightened. He pressed his lips together and shook his head. His small hands gripped the edge of the table again, knuckles white. Eleanor recognized the look instantly. Pain. Loss. A wound too fresh to touch. "You don't have to tell me right now," she said, her voice calm, though her mind churned with questions. "But I want you to know, you're not invisible anymore. Not to me." The words slipped out before she could stop them, surprising even herself. She had spent her life building walls, keeping emotions tucked away where no one could reach them. Yet here she was, offering pieces of her heart to a boy she had met less than an hour ago. Samuel's eyes flicked up to her face, uncertain. Trust didn't come easily to him, but something in her tone, steady, unshaken, made him hold her gaze for the first time. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. Eleanor sat back, the question striking deeper than she expected. Why was she helping him? She could have walked past, like everyone else. She could have left it to security or staff. She didn't have time for this. Her schedule was packed with meetings, negotiations, flights. And yet, none of that mattered when she looked at him. "Because someone should have," she replied simply. The boy blinked, and for a moment, she thought she saw something soften in his eyes. But before either of them could say more, the waitress returned, leaving the check on the table. Eleanor paid without a thought, sliding a crisp bill across. Samuel watched her with quiet curiosity, clearly unused to such ease. "Come on," Eleanor said as she stood. "Let's take a walk." He hesitated again, but this time he rose more quickly, following her through the terminal. She didn't take him to the luxury lounges or private offices. Instead, she led him toward the quieter end of the airport, where fewer travelers passed. The glass walls stretched high, revealing planes glinting in the evening light, their wings sharp against the fading sky. Samuel pressed his hands against the glass, staring at the jets with wide eyes. For the first time, Eleanor saw a spark of wonder in him. "Have you ever flown before?" she asked. He shook his head, his face pressed close to the window. "No," she studied him for a moment. Something about his awe tugged at her. She had flown thousands of times. Private jets, first-class seats, helicopters. To her, air travel was routine. To him, it was magic. "Do you wanna?" she asked. He turned to her, eyes wide. "Me? Fly? I can't. I don't have tickets." Eleanor smiled faintly. "There are ways around that." The words slipped out, half teasing, half serious. Samuel tilted his head, confused. He had no idea who she was. No idea that the woman beside him could summon a jet in minutes if she wished. But Eleanor didn't tell him yet. She wanted him to see her as something other than money, other than power. She wanted to earn his trust without the weight of her name. They walked further until they reached a row of empty seats. Eleanor gestured for him to sit, and when he did, she lowered herself beside him. For a long moment, neither spoke. The hum of the airport filled the silence. Announcements, footsteps, the rolling of suitcase wheels. Finally, Samuel broke the quiet. "My mom, she got sick." Eleanor turned to him slowly, her chest tightening. "She said she'd be okay," he whispered, his voice trembling. "But she didn't wake up. They took her away." His small body shook as he spoke, tears brimming in his eyes. Eleanor reached out, her hand hovering before gently resting on his shoulder. He didn't pull away this time. "I'm so sorry, Samuel," she said softly. "No child should have to go through that." He wiped at his face with his sleeve, sniffling. "They told me. I had to go live with Aunt Carla. But she never came. The lady dropped me here and said someone would come. No one did." His voice cracked. "I thought maybe if I waited long enough, she would find me. But she didn't." Eleanor's jaw tightened, fury surging beneath her calm expression. How could anyone abandon him like this? How could the system fail so badly? Her empire had taught her to look for cracks in every structure, and here was a crack wide enough to swallow a child whole. "Samuel," she said firmly, "you are not going to be left behind again. Do you understand me? Not while I'm here." He stared at her, searching her face for any sign of a lie. When he found none, his small shoulders sagged with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. But Eleanor knew this was only the beginning. Promising safety was one thing. Providing it was another. Taking Samuel under her wing meant crossing into territory she had avoided her entire life. Responsibility not for buildings or companies or fortunes, but for a soul. And as the evening deepened outside the glass windows, Eleanor Briggs, the billionaire who owned the airport, realized that the greatest risk she had ever taken was sitting right beside her, his fragile trust resting in her hands. By the time the airport lights glowed brighter against the night sky, Eleanor had made up her mind. Samuel couldn't be left here another minute. She rose from the bench, smoothing her coat, and offered him her hand. For a moment he hesitated, then, with a deep breath, slipped his small fingers into hers. The simple act, his fragile trust, hit her harder than any business deal ever had. She led him toward the administrative wing, where her private office overlooked the runways. Most of the staff didn't know she was on site, so when they caught sight of her striding through the corridors, whispers spread quickly. Some straightened their uniforms, others pretended to look busy. But Eleanor ignored them all, focused only on the boy at her side. Inside her office, warm light spilled across polished wood and leather chairs. Samuel's eyes darted around, wide with disbelief. He had never been in a place so clean, so quiet, so powerful. He stood stiffly near the door, unsure if he belonged. "Sit," Eleanor said gently, motioning toward the couch. He perched on the edge, his sneakers barely brushing the carpet. Eleanor walked to her desk, picked up the phone, and pressed a button. "Give me the head of security. Now." Within minutes, a tall man in uniform entered. His gaze landed on Samuel, then flicked to Eleanor. "Ma'am, this child has been here for 2 days," she said sharply. "Unnoticed. Unhelped. I want a full report on how this happened. Tonight." The man swallowed, nodding quickly. "Yes, ma'am. And until then," she continued, her tone like steel, "no one lays a hand on him without my permission. He is under my protection." "Yes, ma'am." The guard glanced at Samuel again, this time with a hint of respect, then hurried out. Samuel shifted nervously. Did I do something wrong?" Eleanor crossed the room and crouched in front of him. "No, Samuel. You did nothing wrong. What happened to you was not your fault. Do you understand?" He nodded faintly, though doubt lingered in his eyes. She exhaled, rising again. There were calls she needed to make. to child services, to lawyers, perhaps even to the press if this became messy. But before she could reach for the phone, Samuel spoke. "They'll come for me," he whispered. Eleanor froze. "Who will?" He hugged his knees, rocking slightly. "The men. The ones who came to our house after Mom, after she was gone. They were angry. Said she owed them money. Said if she didn't pay, they'd take me instead." Eleanor's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a case of neglect or abandonment. This child was in danger. Real danger. "Did they hurt you?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Samuel shook his head quickly. "Not yet. But I ran. The lady from the office, she took me to the airport. She said it was safer here. But what if they find me?" His eyes darted to the window as though expecting shadows to rise from the runway. Eleanor's mind raced. Debt collectors. Criminals. If what Samuel said was true, his mother had been tangled in something dangerous, and now the boy was the target. The system would be too slow to protect him. Red tape. Endless paperwork. It could take weeks before anyone acted. By then, it might be too late. She moved closer, sitting beside him on the couch. "Samuel, listen to me. No one is going to take you while I'm here. I promise." "But you don't even know me," he whispered. Eleanor looked into his eyes, seeing not just fear but the desperate hope of a child who wanted to believe. "I know enough. And sometimes, Samuel, that's all it takes." For the first time, he leaned against her, his head resting lightly on her arm. The weight of his trust settled heavily on her chest. She wrapped an arm around him carefully, protective, and in that moment, she knew there was no turning back. Later that night, after Samuel had fallen asleep on the couch wrapped in a blanket, Eleanor stood by the window overlooking the runways. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass. A woman who had conquered boardrooms, signed billion-dollar deals, and crushed rivals without blinking. Yet none of that compared to the quiet responsibility now curled up behind her. Her phone buzzed. It was her assistant, startled to find her working so late. Eleanor answered, keeping her voice low. "Cancel my morning meetings," she ordered. "But, Ms. Briggs, cancel them. Something more important has come up." She ended the call before he could argue. For once, business could wait. But as she turned back to Samuel, a shadow flickered at the edge of her mind. If criminals were involved, they wouldn't stop searching. And if word spread that the boy was in her airport, it could bring danger to her doorstep. She needed a plan, fast. The following morning confirmed her fears. A report from security landed on her desk. 2 men had been seen loitering near the entrances overnight, asking questions about a child. They had been escorted out, but their persistence was alarming. Eleanor clenched her fists, fury burning inside her. How dare they hunt a child like prey? She glanced at Samuel, who was nibbling on a muffin by the couch, unaware of the growing threat. Eleanor knew she had a choice. She could hand him over to the authorities and wash her hands of the mess. It would be the logical thing to do, the safe thing. But logic had nothing to do with the way her heart clenched at the thought of him alone again, waiting, hoping, and being forgotten. No, she wouldn't abandon him, not like everyone else had. But protecting Samuel meant stepping into a fight she hadn't prepared for, a fight against shadows from his past, men with nothing to lose, and perhaps even her own carefully built reputation. And Eleanor Briggs was about to discover that the greatest empire she would ever build wasn't made of glass and steel, but of something far more fragile and far more powerful. Morning sunlight spilled through the tall glass windows, casting golden stripes across Eleanor's office floor. Samuel sat cross-legged on the couch, the remains of his muffin beside him, staring quietly out at the plains. He seemed calmer now, but there was still a heaviness in his eyes, the kind that didn't vanish overnight. Eleanor stood at her desk, reviewing the security report again. 2 men. Persistent. Dangerous. The kind of men who didn't stop until they got what they wanted. She had faced cutthroat businessmen, governments, and lawsuits, but this felt different. This was not about contracts or money. This was about protecting a child who had already lost everything. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor realized she was afraid, not for herself, but for him. She picked up her phone and made a series of rapid calls. First, to her lawyers. Then, to a judge she knew from her philanthropic circles. And finally, to her private pilot. Each call tightened the web of protection around Samuel. Each decision tied her closer to him. By the time she set the phone down, her mind was made up. Samuel was not going back into the system. She would fight to keep him safe, no matter the cost. Samuel turned to her, his small voice breaking the silence. Do I have to leave? Eleanor crossed the room and knelt so her eyes were level with his. Not unless you want to. Do you want to stay with me? His face crumpled as though the question itself was too much to hope for. He nodded quickly, tears welling in his eyes. Yes, please. Eleanor gathered him into her arms, holding him tightly. The boy who had been abandoned, ignored, and hunted finally let himself cry without hiding. And Eleanor, the billionaire known for her icy composure, held him with a tenderness she hadn't known she still possessed. That afternoon, trouble arrived at the airport gates. Security cameras caught sight of the same two men returning, bolder this time, demanding to search for the boy. Their voices were sharp, their threats ugly. The head of security rushed to Eleanor's office, panic in his voice. Ma'am, they're insisting. They say the boy belongs to them. Eleanor's eyes flashed like steel. He belongs to no one but himself. And he's under my protection now. She marched to the observation deck, Samuel's small hand gripping hers. When the men saw her, they froze, not expecting to be confronted by the woman who owned the very ground they stood on. Eleanor's presence radiated authority, her posture unyielding. This airport is my property, she declared, her voice echoing across the polished floor. And this child is under my care. You will not lay a hand on him. The men exchanged uneasy glances. One stepped forward. Lady, you don't understand. His mother owed us. That debt is not this boy's to pay. Eleanor cut in, her voice like thunder. Leave now, or I'll make sure the law buries you so deep you'll never crawl out again. Security closed in, surrounding the men. Realizing they were outmatched, they backed away, spitting curses but retreating all the same. Samuel clung tighter to Eleanor's hand, his small body trembling. She squeezed back, steady and fierce. When the danger had passed, she led him back inside. They won't touch you again, she promised. Not while I'm alive. And she meant it. Over the following weeks, Eleanor worked tirelessly. She hired the best lawyers to secure guardianship, used her influence to clear the legal obstacles, and built a shield of protection around Samuel so strong it could withstand anything. But more than that, she began to build something deeper, a home. At first, Samuel struggled to adjust. He woke from nightmares, afraid the men would come back. He tested Eleanor's promises, half expecting her to disappear like everyone else. But every time he faltered, she was there, steady, patient, unyielding. Slowly, his fear gave way to trust, his silence to laughter. One evening, weeks later, they sat together on the balcony of Eleanor's estate, watching planes glitter like stars across the sky. Samuel leaned against her, holding a toy airplane she had given him. Do you ever get scared? He asked suddenly. Eleanor looked out at the horizon, her heart tight. Yes, she admitted. But I've learned that being brave doesn't mean you're never scared. It means you don't let fear stop you. Samuel thought about that, then nodded. Then I think I can be brave too. Eleanor smiled, pulling him closer. For all her wealth and power, she realized the greatest victory of her life was not an empire of steel and glass, but the fragile, fierce bond she had forged with a boy who once lay motionless on a cold airport bench. The world would remember her as a billionaire, a titan of industry. But Samuel would remember her as something far greater. The woman who saw him when no one else did, who stopped when the world walked by, who gave him not just food and shelter, but a chance at life, love, and family. And in the quiet glow of the evening sky, Eleanor Briggs knew that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be. If Samuel's story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories that will inspire and move you. Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear which part of Samuel and Eleanor's journey impacted you the most.